All right, we are here at SHRM 2025 in San Diego. My name is Jocelyn King, and I'm the CEO of VirgilHR. I'm here with Joanna Colosimo. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Joanna, we talked a little bit about your background before starting the podcast today, and it's really fascinating because you have several different facets, I think, to your professional career that will be really interesting to our audience. We talked a little bit about pay equity and pay equity audits, about risk assessments, about workforce analytics and predictive analytics. So we'll touch on all of those today. But first, I thought it'd be really great if you just gave the audience maybe a 60-second high-level overview of your background.
Sure. Thank you for having me again, Jocelyn. So I have a background in industrial organizational psychology. That's what I went to graduate school for. But for about the last 20 years, I've really spent most of my career in the EEO, pay equity, diversity landscape. And we have spent time as a consultant. I've been a consultant for over 15 years. And prior to that, I was in HR and did a lot of the practical implementation, tactical components of that work. And so I'm based in Washington, D.C. And a lot of my consulting practice has been working with organizations that range the gamut from small federal contractors that may be in IT to large organizations that are defense contractors to international companies. I've done work with board of directors on things like EEO barrier analysis or DEI risk assessments, pay equity studies for large universities. So it's really run the gamut, and it's been really just a fantastic 20 years in this space.
So actually, one thing that we didn't chat about beforehand was DE&I.
Yeah.
And I think that is such a difficult landscape for HR to be navigating right now with these executive orders. It's quite confusing. HR wants to make sure they're doing the right thing. Do you have any practical guidance for HR on how they should be developing and implementing DEI strategies in the workplace?
Yeah, absolutely. That's such a great question. I actually speak on it later today.
Oh, perfect.
So feel free to come by for that. So I would say, there is this concept of illegal DEI and then DEI. And so DEI on its face, diversity, equity, inclusion, isn't necessarily illegal even in this context. But what is problematic are programs that violate things like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act. And that's where you get this term of illegal DEI. And that's what the new executive orders really aligned to. So those practical tips, I would say there are kind of a couple of different questions they would want to ask themselves in terms of their policies, practices, procedures. Asking ourselves questions like, is this program or policy in our DEI program a set aside or a quota or a preference? Or does it supersede merit? Or is it kind of verging on illegal harassment? Or is it exclusionary? Those are 6 questions, the set aside, the quota, the preferences, is it exclusionary? Does it supersede merit? Does it verge on illegal harassment? That I would apply to any sort of DEI policy program or procedure. And then the second part to this would be really asking ourselves, is there anything that we're doing in our organization from an employment perspective that may constitute a violation of anti-discrimination laws, and making sure that we're digging deeper with that in terms of auditing our employment practices. And so I still think a lot of really thoughtful inclusion and diversity programs are legal. They can still comply with these new executive orders. It's just, really digging deeper and understanding what you are and aren't doing with those diversity programs, and just ensure that risk is mitigated.
Do you have an example of what might make DEI illegal?
For sure. So it's a great question. A couple examples I see as common would be setting quotas. That's illegal. Maybe tying executive compensation to like a diversity target. I've seen that in the past where, saying to your executive, like, oh, we're going to compensate you more if you meet this diversity goal. Well, that kind of enters into that quota preferential treatment space that we talked about. And that goes against Title VII case law. I would say certain diverse slate programs, not all, but certain diverse slate programs that may be designed to supersede merit could be an example of something that would especially in the new administration, be considered illegal and violating some anti-discrimination laws. So those are just a couple to throw out there.
Okay, that's really helpful. Now, do you have any suggestions on where HR professionals can go get additional resources to learn more about ways that they can either correct maybe some practices or better improve what they're doing today?
Sure. I mean, I would say two off the top of my head. Not. I'm definitely not trying to self-promote, but we have one. We have a toolkit that we have put together that folks can download with those 6 questions that I outlined and some examples of those policies and procedures, and they can apply that framework of those 6 questions that I outlined earlier to their policies, practices, and procedures. So we have that at DCI. I would say I know SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, has been working on a BEAM framework, which is their answer to providing some toolkit items as well to apply this compliance lens to inclusion and diversity programs as well.
Yeah, actually, I learned more about the BEAM framework from our previous guest, Camille Olson, who I think is speaking with Alphonse over at SHRM later today or tomorrow about the BEAM framework.
Right.
And I find it so wonderful because HR practitioners want to do what's right. And this legislation can sometimes be overwhelming, and there's a lot of misinformation out there as well that makes it really difficult for someone to do their job effectively.
Yeah, absolutely. And I've actually taken a peek at the BEAM framework with Dr. Alonso's guidance. And, we've offered some suggestions as well to align our 6-question framework to help bolster the next version of the BEAM framework. So I think they're going to unleash that later in July, like a 2.0 version to just, because the landscape continues to evolve, right? And so ensuring that they're constantly updating that resource. And I think SHRM has been on top of it because it is a needle to thread. We still want inclusive workplaces. We still value diversity and diverse thought in our workplaces in a very civil and respectful way. And I think SHRM wants that.
Right.
And I think most HR professionals want that, but we're just in a different landscape right now where we have to be really mindful of the legal framework as well. And so just balancing those two priorities is going to be critical for HR professionals going forward.
Yeah. We talk a lot about pay equity. I feel as though there's been a little less chatter about it, but I am still seeing many laws at a state level that are passing, which is incredible, because a few years ago it was just maybe a handful. And so we're starting to see more and more of that movement at a state legislature level, which is fantastic. I'd love to learn a little more from you about your work with pay equity and pay equity audits.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So many years of pay equity audit experience. It's a great topic. And you're exactly right that the state framework and state pay transparency laws have exploded over the last few years. And internationally, if you're an international organization, it's also exploding internationally with the EU pay transparency law. A few years ago, it was the UK wage gap report. So for international organizations, there's a lot that they have to put together in this patchwork of transparency. And the underpinning of all of this is really about, ensuring that we're compensating our professionals and our workforce in general as appropriately as possible, and that we're not, paying a particular demographic group over another differently. We're not taking into account maybe prior salary. We're paying for the value of the job. And so the pay equity work that I have done in the past really digs deep and I'll just use the U.S. law as a framework, uses that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act framework to compare similarly situated employee groups with each other to see if after controlling for merit factors, if there are sex-based differences or race-based differences and how we're paying people. And I think the key there, and this has always been the case, Jocelyn, and I think it's interesting to bring it back now because we talk a lot about merit recently, but it's always been the case when we do pay equity audits that we account for merit in this analysis. And so typically, because I have a workforce analytics background, we use regression or some other statistical means to do the great work to compare people that are in similarly situated jobs, take into account merit, And then after we take into account merit, really ask our question self, is there something wrong here? If there is, let's dig a little deeper. Let's ask some thoughtful questions. Why is that? Why might women be getting paid less than men in a particular job group in our company? Let's dig in and let's ask some really good questions before we jump to conclusions.
I love that. The idea of just asking questions, not as an HR organization, but as a leadership organization, is absolutely critical, I think, to really evaluating not just your pay strategies, but your actual culture. And what does this mean if there is a disparity between sex in terms of pay? What's happening at our organization that's creating this issue? And I think that that's particularly helpful for that HR department of one or really small HR teams that aren't necessarily equipped with all of the data that, for example, your firm would be able to provide. Simply because of the size of their budget or what have you, to be able to then go in and collaboratively work with a leadership team on, hey guys, like, let's really figure out what's going on here and how we can better improve our practices.
Absolutely. And I always think of pay equity too in some of this work that we're doing, even if you're in a small company, it's a little bit like a funnel. You look at the entire workforce and then you find where the hot button issues are. So if you've done an analysis or you've done some really critical questions and you found that, like, wow, we're doing a great job. 85% of our workforce, after we control for merit factors and the similarly situated groups, it looks like we're on target. Let's just focus on this. I'm giving an example, this last 15%, and ask these critical questions, dig a little deeper. And the data can definitely tell a story. Sometimes you do these sophisticated analyses and you start to find issues. And then you ask some follow-up questions. You're like, oh, you know what? We forgot to control for a certification that these 5 people have. And you're like, oh, okay, there you go. Or, oh, you know what? This other group, they actually get a shift differential. And then you re-examine the data and you found, the answer. And then sometimes you don't have a clear answer and it becomes an opportunity to discuss, likely with legal counsel, what to do next. Should we consider adjustments or mitigation, efforts? And when we get to that stage, I think it's an important takeaway that we want to be mindful about how we mitigate salary and be careful of just having a blanket sex or race-based approach to mitigation. And so one thing that I've always done is I look at everybody in the group. Doesn't matter if you're white or blue or Asian or Hispanic or whatever. If you're being flagged as being underpaid, according to your merit factors, we can look at that too. And I think that's an important takeaway for HR professionals, that even if we are, let's just say, finding a sex-based flag, maybe that's just an indicator there's something wrong with that group overall. And there are ways you can kind of start to dig in and ask these questions that we've been talking about.
Absolutely, because I think it goes beyond just what you're legally required to do and does focus more on culture. So to your point, right, if there is a sex disparity, there's a gap there, and you were to mitigate by increasing their pay, what if there were some, let's say those were women, what if there were some men that were being underpaid too? From a culture perspective, how does that impact your workforce?
And absolutely, it's so funny that you bring this up, Jocelyn, because I don't want to rat out anybody, but I would say, let's say 10 years ago, sometimes these flags would happen in some companies. It's just like, oh, well, it's a female-based issue. We're just going to correct all the females, and that's not what I'm seeing anymore. It's really which is good. Yeah. I think to your point, there's the culture issue. It's the employee engagement issue. There's also just the right thing to do. Of okay, well, we flagged these 10 females in this group, but there's these 2 males in this, and this happens. This is just really practical, tactical takeaway. There's these 2 males in these group that also probably should get paid differently, and I'm seeing companies make that commitment of like, yes, all 12. In this group, we're going to adjust. And I think that that's the right thing to do. I actually think that's the lawful thing to do as well. And it also goes back to that holistic, like, what's your strategy? What's your compensation strategy? How are we ensuring that we are creating this inclusive company culture and that we're compensating our people appropriately, fairly? And so it's really a holistic, conversation.
So I wouldn't be surprised if there were HR professionals out there that were battling with budget.
Sure.
And couldn't necessarily increase some folks' pay because of budget issues. How could they go about mitigating risk in that situation?
Yeah, this is a great question. So, I think before you embark on a study or an audit, be really thoughtful about what you know you can and cannot accomplish. I don't think that means don't do the work, don't be an ostrich, don't pretend like you have no problems per se. But there are certain strategies that if we are, if somebody is flagging a pay disparity and you can't explain the pay disparity, you could create a plan like where over time, you're mitigating salary for certain jobs. You could certainly prioritize jobs or certain line of business. Like we're going to focus just on this line of business because we know our turnover is great and we're going to focus there first. And then maybe the next year you focus on the next line of business. So you could certainly phase some of these remediation discussions so that it aligns to your budget, or just have like a phased increase for the individuals or flags. So going back to that example where I had 12 people, 10 females and 2 males, maybe it's a slow increase. Maybe you can't swallow the whole whale at once, but you just start a little bit for each person and proportion to where they need to go.
So another thing that we had chatted about was risk assessments. I think that they can be pretty comprehensive from what you've shared with me. Would you mind just giving us an overview first of what goes into the risk assessments you work on?
Yes. And so this is very comprehensive. So there's a couple buckets of risk assessment. So we have the pay risk assessments, which we kind of talked about, auditing your pay. We would have DEI risk assessment. So in this world of this concept of illegal DEI and just the current environment, you could do a risk assessment, which we talked about earlier, where you're applying those 6 questions in conjunction with some workforce analytics to understand if there are barriers in just your DEI programmatic efforts. And then the third bucket, I would say, is really looking at the entire employee life cycle to see if there are barriers in your recruitment practices, your hiring practices, your promotion practices, your attrition or termination practices. And when we had kind of look at that holistic employee life cycle, there are a couple ways you can approach this, both analytically and qualitatively. And so because I have the passion for workforce analytics, let me talk about that first. So analytically, you can certainly compare each phase of the employee life cycle to maybe availability data, like where you're recruiting from in a requisite recruitment area for those individuals with the requisite skills that you're looking for. So for example, if we're recruiting HR professionals in the St. Louis metropolitan area, what does that look like? What does your representation look like for females and males? Are you at about there with your recruitment strategies? Well, if you're not, ask yourself, well, why? Why are we not? What I love about those analytics, though, and that kind of dashboard approach is that you can actually see over the employee life cycle why you might be, I'll use the word like maybe underrepresented of where you think you should be or overrepresented of where you think you should be. It may be a pocket. It may be in the hiring practice, or it might be in the promotion, or maybe you have no problems in your recruitment and hiring or promotions, but you're having an attrition problem for some reason. Maybe there's a culture issue, and I'll throw it out there. Maybe, your women leaders don't want to work in your organization anymore. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why are they turning over at a certain rate? So that's one way you can approach a risk assessment, to do this kind of roadmap of the entire employee life cycle, map out the analytics to say, where are we seeing problems? And I don't think that there's any problem with this. Again, we're not ostriches. This isn't illegal DEI. This is asking ourselves legitimate questions about our workforce and, not making changes, but being able to diagnose where there could be pockets, or maybe there's a particular line of business or location where there may be some questions that you want to ask a little more nuanced information.
So from a strategic perspective, when HR goes into an assessment like this, should they first consider what is the problem that I'm trying to solve for?
Absolutely.
Or is this like a blanket assessment? I just want to know what our landscape looks like, or it could be both.
Absolutely strategic observation, Jocelyn. So I think it could be both, right? So certainly if you don't know where to start and you're doing like a big picture overview, you could certainly do as I described. I would say though, more often than not, there's usually a question in mind that an HR leader or maybe a business leader has observed. And they say, okay, I don't know what it is. We're having an attrition problem, Jocelyn. Tell me why we can't maintain our workforce in XYZ line of business, for XYZ types of positions. So certainly if you start with that question, you can certainly narrow your focus in these types of audits to ask some really great qualitative questions in conjunction with some of those diagnostic workforce metrics. And depending on, what the question is, you can really kind of dig in deeper to find out if there is a root cause problem. And sometimes the root cause problem is completely facially neutral, or it's completely just something you didn't even think about, like a policy or a wording or a messaging that just didn't sit well with your employees. Sometimes it could be a manager or a department or a line of business. Sometimes it's truly a culture issue. There's a variety of things that I have seen. Sometimes it's a perception issue. Sometimes we've done work for clients where their employees have a perception that something is wrong. And we've done all of this work. And then you find out through the qualitative interviews that it's more of the messaging from managers. And we've done all these workforce analytics and we found no problems. And we did all the things that you would do in a defense, litigation type worthy analysis. You're like, I don't see a problem. And then you do some interviews and you're like, oh, it's a messaging thing. It's a culture thing. So that happens too.
That's interesting. And I think it's good to just remind people that sometimes it isn't all about the technology. Sometimes it's going to be those qualitative conversations, and those are equally important in these types of situations.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, last question I have for you is a bit more about analytics, but on the predictive side. I'd be really curious to hear a bit more about your experience with predictive analytics. And if you wouldn't mind just closing the show with how can an HR practitioner leverage predictive analytics? Where can they find tools to leverage predictive analytics that might serve them well?
Yeah, great question. So I think predictive analytics it's going to explode in alignment with AI, and there are going to be a variety of tools on the market soon, if not already, to help you do that. We have one too, so I'll just leave that there. But there's a couple. Let me just kind of throw out a couple ideas. It depends what you're trying to answer, right? What question are you trying to answer, Jocelyn? But we've used predictive analytics to trend data from the past, like what our hiring, promotion, attrition rates may have been, and project out, like if we're on the same trajectory as we have been for the last 5 years, where are we going to go in the future? Like what would our attrition rate be? What would our promotion rate of females be into leadership positions? Okay, you can also use that to tweak the formula to say, okay, there's going to be a big business disruption. We know there's going to be a big business disruption, let's say maybe in a line of business. Let's downgrade or upgrade this by a particular percentage, or make a calculation to align for that business change, and then project it out. We were able to project things out for an organization recently up to 50 years, like, how they're based on what their hiring and promotion rates had been. They were looking at a particular, what the landscape would look like in the next few decades. But, that's really hard. That's like way beyond any long range strategic plan that any of us have. So, I think that predictive analytics and AI tools are going to probably be the norm in the next few years. And it just really goes back to what questions are you trying to ask in HR? Again, my background has a little bit more diversity and representation, and I look at demographic groups. So you could do that, but you could also just use the data for straight up, like, what is our attrition going to look like in the next 2 to 3 years with regard, without regard to demographic groups or representation. So I do think that's the way of the future. And then if we meet again next year at SHRM 26, I'll have so much more to say on this matter, Jocelyn, because I think you're going to see so much more of it in the coming year.
I can't wait. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. It was super enlightening and a pleasure.
It was such a pleasure. It was so nice to meet you. Thank you for having me.